Okay guys, we're heading into this new texture. I just want to mention first that I'm completely aware of the fact that we have been on 3-bet pot out of position for hours now. And you might be thinking, Nick, why is this not more balanced in terms of looking at other lines? The reason for me is that I really think this is one of the most highly exploitative territories that's most valuable to your win rate, and it allows me to pretty much give the demonstrations as far as procedural tools that I think you'll need to apply to every other line. So as soon as I finish this texture, basically you guys are going to have all of the procedural tools necessary to go ahead and use what I've taught you with every single other line. So when we get to single raise pots, it's going to be me sort of bringing you through the motions of connecting the dots with where the same procedures apply, as well as still giving you tactical aces where I think it's relevant for win rate. But it will be much more effortless. And I guess that's what I was alluding to earlier, was that because of the fact that I've laced this thing so tight in the first 3 hours in terms of procedure, now it kind of opens up toward the end. And it's like, oh yeah, there's all these different lines, but it's the same process over and over again. And for me, that was very relieving when I was devising this sort of system, I guess you would call it, is that I was never really finding myself in foreign territory with how to approach a model or a quote unquote problem at that point. And that's what led me to a pretty square conviction that I'd stumbled across something that was very sustainable as far as a learning process. So let's get into this. This is 9-5 deuce rainbow, 3-bet out of position, button calls preflop, same preflop ranges. I've put this up here for accountability with the optimal model using a 1/3 c-bet where we almost get to c-bet our entire range. And the only reason I'm showing that is because in positions MDF, we'll call it his optimal MDF for all intents and purposes, is slightly, well, he's folding slightly more. So we would say that his MDF is slightly lower as opposed to here, where when he knows that I'm c-betting my entire range, which is like a couple percent more, he decides to fold slightly less. In other words, his MDF is higher. He calls about 1% more. Raising frequencies are about the same. So just noting that basically for accountability that this is the optimal MDF that we're basically looking at him playing. I want to compare this to the ace-9-4 board that we were looking at previously, because what I found that was counterintuitive and I think definitely worth noting is that on 9-5 deuce, out of positions at a larger range advantage quite significantly. He's looking at 130 as opposed to 118. These are the optimal models for both. And the interesting thing about it is that in position actually folds more when he's pushing more EV. Take a look here. In position only folds 16% as opposed to 22.5, yet in positions got more EV in the ace-9-4 model. So what's going on here more or less? It's leading us into our first new context threshold, I guess, which is that we're going to have to release the notion that MDF on the flop is directly correlated to EV. We could definitely say that there's trends, but the nature of this low flop is such that in position has so many overcards in his range that have so much equity realization, and also so much implieds when he does pair something like, say he had a queen jack or something. If he turns a jack, obviously that's a really strong pair that not only retains a lot of equity but also has a lot of implieds because it can value bet for probably 2 future streets. If he turns a 10, that's an open-ended straight draw that's got a lot of implied value. If he turns an 8 or a king, those are gutters that spike every now and then. So he's got a lot of hands in his range that on other textures would not retain as much equity and would not have as much of a robust value betting quality when they do improve. So because of that, he can actually call more, and he should be calling more on the flop, even though he's at more of a range disadvantage in terms of just the EVs. So it's giving us insights into how range composition in terms of the equity distributions are actually messing around with mandatory defense frequencies in a way that seems sort of counterintuitive. So again, it should expand our context in the sense that it shows us that MDF is at the effect of solving for equilibrium. There's no such thing as naive MDF, like once we exit rigid toy game models. So that's our first cool takeaway as far as context breakthrough from this. And now we're going to go in and see if the 16% optimal defense is something that's actually a reasonable environmental strategy that we should expect to see from in position. If not, we're going to lock something that's more natural and look at the model that way. So let's blow this up for a second. First of all, he's raising 13%, which I've looked at some environmental trends for 500 zoom. Guys are playing a raising range, not quite this much on 9 and 10 high textures, but I think they're playing more like 8 or 9%. I'm going to throw this out here right now that I have groups, specific members within groups who are very advanced at creating subsets and have already spent tens of hours on doing it. They're considering putting it together, compiling it in a way where it's very advanced, site specific, where you can have certain like upgrades to pack 2 or something if you want to buy the Bovada subset pack, and it'll have distributions of a lot of different lines where there are PO solver aggregations right next to environmental deviations. I think my Bovada guy is planning on doing it as a tutorial, showing you how to do it yourself. And I have at least one guy on PokerStars who was thinking about putting out more of an advanced pack for it. The problem is with the amount of hours that these guys are putting into building these aggregation reports and laying them against the environmental trends, they can't not sell them for a lot of money because it's taken them a lot of time to create them and they're really valuable. So whether or not those actually come to fruition, I guess will be based on the demand that Pack 2 members have for them. But I do want to throw that out there. That's sort of like something that's in the mix, and maybe the tutorial thing for guys who are on Bovada might be more of a easy purchase. For guys that are really serious about it, maybe you do want to like pick up a pack that's maybe like, I don't know, we're thinking $800 to $1,000. That's just like every single stat listed for the environment, for like either like PokerStars 500 Zoom or whatever the biggest demand is for environments, because somebody's not going to go make a subset for an environment that nobody's going to buy. You know what I mean? So it's in the mix. It'll be something that I think comes to fruition based on the demand for it. All that being said, let's take a look at this defense, because that's how I know that that environmental trend was like, I think that they're raising like 9 or 10% for in position on like a certain 9 or 10 high board in this line. Like this guy has it mapped out in a very detailed, like very advanced way, in my opinion. So it wouldn't be something that I would put out unless I thought that it was like really well done, and I was pretty impressed when he showed me even the preliminary copy of it. So for the most part, I don't think that the environment's playing anything close to this as far as only folding 16%. If you take a look at all the broadways that they're required to float, it's just not happening. I mean, consistently people are folding king jack off, queen jack off, king 10 off, queen 10 off. All of these backdoor flush draws need to get floated, which doesn't happen. Those are getting folded at some frequencies. I do think all pairs get called, so it's not a problem. Depends on what site you play on here. I think that some sites will come closer than others. If you're playing on Bovada, like even if you're playing upwards of 10-20, you're still going to see guys fold this Broadway region like consistently. So what I've done is gone and made what I believe to be more of an environmental representation of maybe the spread of all of the environments, and having them overfolding substantially but still reasonably. So here's my lock. I've got it up to 21% fold, and I've taken the raise down to about 8% too. So again, it's having him fold more, and the defense is also less intense because it smacks out of position with raises less often. We've talked about that before. Pretty much what I've done is just taken out some broadways, taken out some backdoor flush draws. Simple enough. So we're going to use this one, and let's go in and make our turn aggregation report. First things first. So remember, this is going to be in your reports folder of wherever you keep your PO solver stuff. Okay, so this is going to be the aggregation report that we look at when we're analyzing what our turn barreling strategy is going to look like as out of position. I'm going to put this one on hold for a second because what I'm interested in quite a bit, as far as the context lacing for you guys, is to explore what's going on with in position's defense versus turn barrel, on account of the fact that he plays this very like overcard heavy floating range, even though he was at pretty substantial range disadvantage. more so than on the ace-9-4. So in order to pull up an aggregation report where I can compare different types of turn fold frequencies for in position when he faces the turn barrel, I have to change the node for the aggregation. So we're still going to use this one, but I'm going to put it on hold, and I'm going to make an aggregational report for this node where in position is now facing the bet. So same thing. Remember guys that in order to bring them up side by side, you're going to have to change the second one to something other than report. Doesn't matter what you change it to, but just remember, otherwise it won't let you open two at a time because it always saves them both as report. Okay, so first let's take a look at the average fold frequency. That's what I love about this, is that like it's already got the averages of everything laid out for you in this blank square right away. So we see that in position on average folds about 37.5% across all textures, across all turns. So the first thing that I'm interested in is comparing that to the ace-9-4 board to see what in position's average MDF was there, see what kind of context advancements we can pick up. So I have a choice here for what defense I want to use when I compare this to the ace-9-4 board. This is the optimal model where we're not even locked for 100% range. I think I'm just going to use his 23% fold frequency because it's closer, I think, in terms of like a comparative representation than locking him for 31 on a texture where I think he's probably substantially overfolding in practice. Remember, both of these models that we're looking at right now are facing the optimal turn c-bet, and for the relevant purposes of our modeling, at this point we're trying to gain contextual knowledge in a more theory-oriented sense. So we will go and create more relevant strategies for us in terms of like what's incentivized exploitatively, but for now we're looking at like the theory stacking part of it. So my purpose here is to compare turn MDF versus out of position c-bet for in position's MDF. So I'm going to have him call, and again I'm going to put the c-bet down, and I'm going to run the aggregation here, and we're going to compare the averages and sort some turns for the 9-5 deuce and figure some stuff out. Okay, so here it is. We actually have in position folding slightly more on average here. I'm interested too in the gradient of the folds. So let's take the range of like 36, which is the least amount he ever folds, and looks like he's actually folding 44 on a 4, which was the best card for our range. So it's from like 36 to 44 that is looking like his MDF range is. Back to the 9-5 deuce, where I'm looking at a spectrum of looks like 32 all the way up to, I see a 42 already. So it kind of looks like there's a wider range for this one, and I already kind of know this because that's what I'm leading into, but what I want to show you guys is what's going on with some certain turn cards that are not interacting well within position's wide calling range and what happens at optimal in those spots. So what I'm going to do now is sort for in position EV from smallest to largest, and we're going to take a look at if we can find any patterns for where he's folding a lot more, if they're on cards that are actually much worse for his range on the turn. So I've sorted from EV smallest to largest for in position, and the main thing that I want to point out is that, like I said, that folding gradient is wider than it was on the ace-9-4, and there are definite gaps in position's defense here on the turn because of how many overcards he floats. Like he ends up folding more on the turn blanks. Like you can see, like a deuce, his fold is pretty high. His 3, his fold is really high, up at 42. It's also like that for a 4, is up at 42. And then there's cards where out of position just improves way more, like a king, and he's also forced to fold like upwards of like 42. So just to build a little bit of context and to teach you guys how to sort of explore relevantly when you're trying to initially get a gauge of what's going on with turn range versus range interaction, this is a cool way to go about doing it. The reason that I'm pointing this out for this texture and comparing it to the ace high texture is I thought it was a cool way to compare two very different types of distributions. So that's why I thought it was sort of relevant, because we do have two very different in position calling distributions going to the turn. So I thought it made sense to check out the MDF frequencies and see how they sort of deviate and it can help us to understand where there's holes in the range, albeit proper theoretical holes. Like for some reason, in position thinks it's okay to be able to fold that much on a 3 or a 4. Like it's almost saying these cards don't occur often enough for it to make me not want to float as many overcards as I am on the flop. And that's what we're going to sort of get into next is like, yeah, there's these holes in position's range when facing turn barrel, but if we take a look at out of position's overall c-bet, we can go back over to our other report, which was based on the turn c-bet, and we can scroll up to the average, which is right here, bring it across, and we can see that out of position is still restricted to a 39% c-bet at optimal on this turn. So it's relatively low in the sense that what in position's flop calling strategy is designed to do is be able to hit on enough turns with enough equity or EV, whichever way you want to call it, that he still restricts out of position's turn c-bet enough that in position guarantees himself a decent amount of extra realization after turn goes check check, which is important when his range is comprised of a lot of different or high composition of overcards from the flop. So it's an intricacy that I thought was worth mentioning because it sort of explains how in position is able to get away with calling so many extra hands, leaving gaps in his range on the turn where he's substantially overfolding as far as what it seems on the gradient of his folding spectrum. Yet it still is suggested as optimal by solver because of the fact that he's still able to restrict out of position's optimal c-bet frequency enough that in position is able to realize enough of his overcard equity all the way to the river. Because if you think about like when he gets a check back here, 60% of the time, like forcing out of position to check 60% of the time, and then in position can snap check back and realize all that overcard equity, that's a pretty big deal. So solver's clearly looking at all of that, and I thought it was kind of an advanced release that can give you guys some insights onto why it's definitely necessary to be floating very aggressively with overcards on these low boards, especially when you're in position. Because even though there will be holes in your range, and even though there will be turn cards where you miss pretty hard on, you're still overall restricting out of position's turn barrel enough that you're incentivized to float those hands to sort of wait for that realization to the river. And again, it's not just the river realization, it's not the only factor, but it is definitely a factor. And the rest of it is that sometimes you're going to turn top pair with those hands and they're just going to have great implied value. So let's take a look at some best and worst turn range versus range interactions. In position is doing very well on the 7s and the 8s. Those are the best cards for his range. And the worst is like a deuce and a 3. So usually what I do when I explore for relevance to expand my contextual understanding of the texture is I will go into the range explorers and look at the hot and colds and the different distribution layouts of these types of turns, and I'll come to different sort of conclusions about how the ranges are interacting. So that's what I want to do with you guys right now real quick with the 7, the 8 as compared to like a deuce and a 3. Let's take a look at the 7 and let's look at the equity push first of all, which is about 50.7, and let's compare it to the deuce, and then let's compare the range explorers for nutted distributions and see what we get. So hot and cold equity for out of position here is substantially more on the deuce. I'm assuming it's going to be pretty much the same for the 3, and then if we shifted back to the 8, we would see similar trends. Like this is pretty much the worst, I think, for in position is this 3. Out of position pushes 56% equity, and EVs are pretty much the highest for out of position too. So okay, let's use this 3, and we'll use the 7, and we'll explore with Range Explorer what the nutted distribution asymmetries are too. We're already seeing that there's substantial hot and cold asymmetries. So let's explore in positions 2 pair plus, or we can even go as far as overpair. He doesn't have any, so that's kind of a big deal. But in positions looking at 7.5% 2 pair plus here, as opposed to out of position 6.8. Now heading over to the 7, we're seeing 8.5 versus 5.9. So in positions simultaneously picking up that hot and cold region and the nutted distribution, which is leading to the hardcore asymmetries in terms of EVs between the 7 and the 3 and like the 8 and the deuce. So you can see sort of how to explore this in a way that it makes sense to you. And the visuals here are cool too if you want to see sort of how that range interacts. But it's not something that I think is part of the normal player's context or even the winning HSNL player's context. Like, I don't think many players train themselves to see the 7 in terms of categorized range versus range interaction. Like, I don't think many players could tell you that the 7 is the worst card for out of positions range on the turn, and the best card for in positions range for that reason. So I think it's pretty valuable because it's going to give you really good insights into how you want to simplify your turn strategies. Because on this board, the main thing to keep in mind from the aggregational reports is that, remember, out of position c-bet frequency is substantially higher, and the gradient that he c-bets is wider. He's looking at a spectrum of like something like 40%, as opposed to on the ace-9-4 where it was between like 8% and, I don't know, 29% or something like that. So there are going to be turns where we're losing a lot of accuracy if we were to check range, and for that reason we're going to be forced to start building in a front door aggression turn c-bet range here. It's not a problem. In fact, it's actually quite fun because we're going to do it pretty surgically. We're going to use this grid to help us sort of devise that strategy. So the simplest way to do that in terms of retaining a highest amount of simplified accuracy is going to be to sort by turn bet frequency. The reason I'm doing this is I want to get a gauge of what card solver's barreling more, and I want to understand what the dynamics are of RVRI that are incentivizing that barrel, because it's not always the higher EV cards that out of position's barreling, like in terms of ordered down the line. It's not always just highest EV, highest c-bet. There's a lot of subtleties that go on in certain regions on certain cards where we're going to take a look at why higher c-bet's incentivized, where both players are hitting the card somewhat equally. So I've sorted c-bet from smallest to largest. The main way that I usually go about this is I'll pick a threshold of a part of the grid where if the c-bet is below a certain amount, those are going to be the hands that I simplify towards check range on. And that'll sort of be my starting point. Because if you remember, part of the strategy in terms of remaining undetectable is revolving around me being intelligent enough to monitor my frequencies manually. And I'm doing that at this point of my system creation, more or less. So it's important to me that I sort of start with this baseline of like, where is the threshold where I'm going to start by checking range upward in terms of simplifying my c-bet. Because if I don't have that, then I can't get abusive with my c-bet frequencies on boards where c-betting is more incentivized. And I want to be able to do that because that's the most general way to gear my exploits, I feel like, is that there is going to be a general correlation between out of position having higher EV on cards that were c-betting more. It's not always going to be the case. There's going to be some cards, like I said, where both sides hit it hard and the range versus range just incentivizes high c-bet naturally. But basically what I'm trying to do is converge my frequencies so that when these ones are checking range and making me look more passive, I'm taking advantage of it in this category down here where I'm actually going to be c-betting abusively wide. And I'm going to show you that in position is actually going to be overfolding in those spots too, because his MDF is quite challenged across the board. So what I end up with is a strategy that converges to look sort of balanced, but I've devised it manually in a way where I'm checking range on the card so that it makes most sense to check range on as a simplification, because it's just smarter to check range on a card where you're only supposed to see about 35% and you're at more of a range disadvantage in general than a card where you're supposed to have, say, a 57% c-bet. So that's sort of the general strategy, and now the fun part or the explorative part is to go in and sort of see how that works and start to create in-game thought processes that we can use on the fly to sort of mix and match how we're going to piece the strategy together.